Hello everybody, my name is Julia Peyton-Jones and I'm Director of the Gallery and Co-Director of Exhibitions and Programmes. This year's event is the 7th in the Serpentine Gallery's series of marathons, conceived by Hans-Ulrich Obrist in Stuttgart in 2005 and launched during his first year at the Gallery in 2006, when he became Co-Director of Exhibitions and Programmes and Director of International Projects. The next 2.5 days of presentations, discussions and performances will approach the theme of memory from an immensely wide range of perspectives. In fact, a part of the marathon is already a memory. Tarek Atoui's fantastic 5-hour live performance, La Suite, opened the marathon yesterday evening, providing an incredible journey through the history of Tarab and classical Arab music. It was a wonderful start to the weekend. The Memory Marathon brings together voices from the worlds of art, film, history, photography, literature, astronomy, robotics, poetry, engineering, technology, architecture, design, neuroscience, criticism, and music, in order to foster what we are sure will be a hugely stimulating exchange of ideas within and across disciplines. In itself, the sheer breadth of the contributions this weekend suggests the degree to which memory is at once the most universal of human capacities, as well as something upon which we all have a necessary personal perspective, and upon which we each have a deeply individual claim. I think that creative work, in all its variety, is very much about fostering a kind of mediation of the universal and individual. Art, music, writing, and architecture can work to translate and to make sense of the personal in the social, and the social in the personal. Memory, I would suggest, is the preeminent site of this mediation. It is the point at which the individual becomes public and vice versa. What we call collective memory is really the accumulation and public mediation of our individual private memories. Collective memory requires the interiority of the private, but only by becoming public in this way can memory itself be preserved. The theme of this year's marathon is derived from the outstanding pavilion on the gallery's lawn, which is being created by the collaborative partnership of Herzog de Meuron and Weiwei, who, to our enormous regret, is still unable to leave China to be with us. In his absence, the lobby of the Serpentine Gallery is displaying a selection of quotations from Ai Weiwei on the subject of memory. I see this pavilion, in particular, as an example of precisely this kind of mediation or translation at work. The precise substance of its accumulation of memory is, of course, something public and shared, but it is also something that is very personal to me. Herzog, de Meuron and Ai Weiwei's pavilion has taken as its starting point the history of the Serpentine Gallery Pavilions, which now reaches back through 11 realized structures over a period of 12 years, all the way back to our initiation of this annual program in 2000. It is customary for me in these introductions to list the previous incarnations of the pavilions. Here, of course, the list has a special pertinence. Each architect or practice's name on the list stands for a specific conjunction of energies and a specific group of people, all working together at a unique moment in time to produce something absolutely remarkable. And, not least, particular to that unrepeatable combination of efforts, the list conjures innumerable associations, innumerable memories, in my mind far too many to recount, and so the list itself will have to suffice. Zaha Hadid in 2000, the following year Daniel Libeskind with Arab in 2001, Toyo Ito with Arab 2002, Oscar Niemeyer in 2003, MVRDV with Arab Unrealized the next year, Alvaro Caesar and Eduardo Soto de Moura with Cecil Baumann of Arab in 2005, Rem Koolhaas and Cecil Baumann with Arab in 2006, Olafur Eliasson and Kjetil Thorsen in 2007, Frank Gehry 2008, Sejima and Nishizawa Osana in 2009, Jean Nouvel 2010, and Peter Zumthor in 2011. It is a tremendous achievement, a roll call of the fallen and a lap of honor that reads almost like a kind of cenotaph, although each name contains many more, and in each case, many individuals have along the way contributed towards the greater goal. The list represents to me at once a substantial period of my own time at the Serpentine, as well as the shared time of the pavilions themselves, their conception, their planning, their production, their realization and use, and their eventual removal, all to either be recited or placed in storage until such time they may be brought into use once again. This pavilion will soon begin its own journey into memory. This weekend is the last time that it will be experienced in its original incarnation, as the process of deinstallation will begin on Monday. This shared time of the pavilion reaches out from the public to the private. It is the shared time of the Serpentines and the architectural teams, but it is also the pavilion's place as a key fixture in London's cultural calendar, as the shared site for innumerable personal memories, and as witnesses to the city, the history of the city over the first decade of the 21st century. It is then a history both personal and public, and it is this duality that Herzog, Meuron, and Weiwei have explored here with such sensitivity. More specifically, it is the overlapping history of the pavilion's forms that has enabled this year's architects to create a complex and beautiful space that both picks up on the buried treasures and traces of each of the earlier buildings, and yet creates something entirely unique. Herzog, Meuron, and Weiwei's material is nothing less than the fabric or texture of memory itself. As they dug down to a depth of 5 feet below the park's surface, more or less clear evidence of the former pavilions was unearthed, remnants of their more or less invasive interventions into the natural environment of the park, as the architects put it. These traces have, in themselves, by no means clearly dictated the manner in which memory of each of the former pavilions might be resurrected and reworked. The task of developing the new pavilion on the basis of the old can therefore be said to have required a considerable effort of invention on the architect's part, an ingenious resolution to the problem of remarking the previous existence of the 11 very different structures linked only by a shared site. In fact, it's archaeology, to a large degree, which is fictional. The remnants of the previous buildings are the stepping stones for the architect's creative license. Almost as if, standing for the public and the private aspects of memory, this year's pavilion is a marriage of both the symbolic and experiential aspects. Of its 12 load-bearing columns, 11 symbolize a previous pavilion. The 12th column has a uniquely reflexive symbolic function. It stands for the 12th, as a whole, as the resurrection of the traces of the previous 11. Together, the columns can be read, in a sense, as miniature monuments within the large meta-monument of the 2012 pavilion. Meanwhile, if the memorial function of the monument is intrinsically public, the interior of the pavilion suggests a singularity of private sensory experience. Beneath the steel canopy, the space is clad entirely of cork, which, as the architects point out, is a natural material with great haptic and olfactory qualities. The pavilion works on the associative level of its material, evoking the reciprocity, the deep intimacy even, of memory and the senses. In these ways and other ways, the pavilion thus operates in both the symbolic and experiential registers. Herzog, Meuron, and Weiwei's emphasis on the haptic and the olfactory thus opens onto the dimension of sensory experience in general, as that which is deeply intertwined with the mental operations of memory. Naturally, this convergence of the sensory and the memorial can only be illustrated by way of personal example. Not long ago, I found myself in Rome, where I happened to be walking down an entirely unpromising and in itself entirely unmemorable street. Nevertheless, something about the specific coming together of the elements in this street and at this time shook me profoundly. The cobblestones of the pavement, perhaps the quality of the light, the humidity, the smells, none of these things were remarkable in themselves, and yet they coalesced to trigger within me an experience that I can only describe as a tsunami of absolute recollection, specifically of the time that I lived in Florence, aged 19. It was an internal rupture that at once completely abstract and also utterly visceral, that took me out of myself, out of that street, out of Rome, and out of the present, transporting me directly into the past. It was overwhelming and very disturbing, and it took at least a week for me to recover from this shock and to fully return to the present. I mention this episode in order to demonstrate just how powerful, and indeed how physically powerful, memory can be, despite what we so often take to be its benign intangibility. Memory, it seems, is as much bodily as it is mental. Some miraculous combination of neurological processes stimulated by the unique qualities of my immediate sensory environment virtually threw me out of my current self and into the shoes of my younger self. Florence, age 19, is a memory of mine, to be sure, but this wasn't a willful act of memory on my part. Rather, memory was working on me. More than any other human capacity, memory constitutes our personal identity. Without it, we are disconnected from the world and from ourselves. The overriding significance of memory for our own sense of self explains our frustration when memory fails us, deceives, or indeed confuses us. I'm reminded of the great American composer Robert Ashley's comment, "It's complicated here in my memory." This significance also explains our profound fear of the prospect of memory's loss, of the trauma of amnesia, and the tragedy of Alzheimer's disease. It is also at the heart of dystopian futuristic visions of memory's artificial implantation or eradication, and the ensuing crisis of personal identity, captured in the nightmare visions of Philip K. Dick's fantastical stories. Memory is indispensable for our understanding of who we are, but also my own experience demonstrates it can be sometimes felt as something alienating, as an uncontrollable force acting on us from within. It is perhaps in these moments that we come closest to experiencing memory at its purest and to appreciating the fullest capacity of memory in its essence. Though it takes a documentary rather than a strictly experiential or phenomenological approach to the topic, Henri Sala's great video of 1998, Inter Vista, dwells on precisely this shock-like character of memory. It deals specifically with the occasional demand that memory makes on us, that we confront our own past and experience the jarring disjunction between ourselves and in the present and our former selves. In this work, the artist comes across a reel of 16mm film of his mother, Valdette, in 1977 at the age of 32. He shows it to her in a living room over 2 decades later. In the found footage, Sala's mother is being interviewed for the television in her capacity as head of the Communist Youth Alliance of Albania, seated beside the country's leader, Enver Hoxha, and discussing the ongoing project of building communism. She is visibly shocked, not least because this evidence of her past life has long been consigned to oblivion. The film is silent, and only with the assistance of a lip reader has Sala managed to piece together the missing soundtrack. Having all but repressed this episode, as well as having lost the political convictions of her youth, remembrance here comes as a shock. In Inter Vista, memory works on Sala's mother as something quite traumatic. She says to her son, "It was real, Henri, because we were building." That statement, "it was real," of course refers to the reality of the political situation in Albania in the 1970s, as well as the reality of her revolutionary zeal. But it also contains a sense of shock at the simple but disturbing fact that this was her, once upon a time. She is confronted with a person whom she recognizes but no longer knows, and whom she cannot quite believe was in fact herself. Similarly, I search for understanding in old photographs to try and know the person I see and whom I recognize, but whom I don't quite remember, and who seems so different to the person that I am now, because they have so much yet to live and to discover in order to become me. The person in the photograph is myself, but who exactly was that? What was I like? What connections, what aspects of personal identity link the person then to the person now? Are they one and the same? I've sometimes asked friends and family to answer these questions. Perhaps their powers of recollection are greater than mine, and perhaps they might have a better purchase on precisely who I was for having been able to observe me, as it were, from outside. Memory, it seems, is always a dynamic of internal and external, of internal recollection and external cues. It is, in a sense, a meeting ground between feeling and recognition. In Sala's video, as in my own experience in Rome, the psychological, the mental, and the emotional all play a role in the specific texture of memory. But where my own experience, my flight from Rome to Florence, was entirely personal to me, Sala's work is a complex mediation on the way in which the individual and the social, personal and public memory are connected. Part of the shock, I think, that Sala's mother experiences stems from the recognition, or rather the slow realization, moving in the video from shock to ironic distance to an appeal to the seriousness of her former struggle, as to how different were the public, political, and social conditions of the 70s to those of the late 90s. At the very least, we can say that she experiences at the encounter with her useful self that cannot be neatly distinguished from the shock at the profundity of the historical gulf, at how so much could change in so short a period of time. As Weiwei puts it, discussing the significance of memory for this year's pavilion, the past is above all a psychological condition. The philosopher and sociologist Maurice Halbachs, a follower of Emile Durkheim, was among the first to recognize and to explore in depth the complex interconnectedness of the personal and social dimensions of memory. Halbachs pioneered the concept of collective memory as a social framework in research from the 1920s and 30s that culminated in his book on collective memory of 1950. There he concluded that human memory is really only possible within the context of a collective, in other words, within some form of society. Memory presupposes the capacity to register our perceptions, which is only possible on the basis of a shared system of signs. Therefore, as he wrote, there are no recollections which can be said to be purely interior, that is, which can only be preserved within individual memory. The cognitive sociologist Aviatar Zerbuval is among those to pursue the path of inquiry first opened up by Halbachs. In his 1999 book, Social Mindscape, Zerbuval investigates the way in which practices of remembering, the operations of memory, occur in different ways across generations, across regions, and across cultures. The immensely complex set of influences, part genetic, part behavioral, and environmental, that shape the way in which we remember. Zerbuval discusses the social foundations of mental operations such as perceiving, attending, classifying, remembering, and reckoning the time, and argues that what happens inside our heads is profoundly affected by our social environment, and especially by our membership of particular groups. In a suggestive statement, and one that speaks to the embarrassment and subsequent defensiveness of Sala's mother in Intervista, Zerbuval says, mental acts such as remembering are not just psychologically constrained human acts, but are also unmistakably social acts bound by specific normative constraints. Ignoring or forgetting something often presupposes some social pressure, however tacit, to exclude it from our attention or memory. Zerbuval speaks of our cognitive diversity as members of different thought communities. However, he also stresses that none of us belongs to just one of these communities alone. Rather, we each exist at a unique intersection of thought communities. Our identity as memory beings is constantly shifting according to the conditions and our environment, and according to our prevailing concerns at any time. The way in which memory works and what it works to recall never stays still. Memory, both in its form and content, is above all adaptive. Therefore, however much memory is a universal capacity, it also operates differently and radically differently individually. Memory both unites and divides us, and culture is about fostering collective memory as a way to bridge the gap that exists between each of us. To this extent, memory lies at the heart of any collective or cultural project, since it implies its own communication, its own dissemination. Indeed, communication and the dissemination of ideas are at the heart of the Serpentine's marathons. As unrepeatable events, their legacy is itself a series of memories. I shall list them too, though I must of course resist the urge to recount a full list of their participants. Hans-Ulrich Obrist has been the catalyst for all these events, and in almost every case, they have been developed in dialogue with the architects. This year, Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron have been integral to the concept of the Memory Marathon. The series began with the interview marathon, a round-the-clock series of debates in 2006, co-curated by Hans-Ulrich Obrist and Rem Koolhaas. This was followed by the Experiment Marathon in 2007, conceived in collaboration with Olafur Eliasson, the Manifesto Marathon in 2008, the Poetry Marathon in 2009, the Map Marathon, and last year's Garden Marathon. It should finally always be remembered that memory is not innocent, and the project of cultivating collective memory is always a battle, fought over the interpretation of the past. What are those socials, and by extension political pressures, that might compel the exclusion of certain memories from our attention and from the attention of history? Talk of mnemonic battles takes me finally to the discipline of history itself. The notion suggested of the interpretation of the past as an ongoing political battle is nowhere better encapsulated than in the phrase belonging to the dearly missed Eric Hobsbawm, who memorably characterized the discipline of history as nothing less than a protest against forgetting. Eric Hobsbawm was arguably the greatest historian of his generation. The breadth and depth of his learning was quite simply staggering, and his writing brought the past to life like no other. He had an appeal that far exceeded the confines of academia and will be remembered as one of the great intellectuals of the 20th century. His quartet of books on world history, spanning the period of the French and Industrial Revolutions to the fall of the Soviet Empire, stands together with the recent books centered around different aspects of globalism, especially global conflict, as among the most valuable documents of understanding who we are today and how we became who we are. They are memory works of the highest caliber. As I'm sure you are aware, Eric Hobsbawm was due to participate in one of our discussions this weekend. And his absence from the Memory Marathon will, I'm sure, be felt by all of us here. We dedicate the marathon to his memory, and it is to the continuation of the spirit of Hobsbawm's life's work as a protest against forgetting that we hope the next 2 days of events will make its own distinct contribution. Many people have worked tremendously hard to make this weekend happen, and I will try to thank as many as I can. On behalf of Hans-Ulrich and myself, I would like to thank all of our participants in the Memory Marathon. Tarek Atoui's La Suite has been commissioned by the Sharjah Art Foundation with the generous support of Bada Jafra, and we thank them both. We would also like to thank Tarek himself, as well as all the outstanding performers who performed last night. Special thanks to Tarek Atoui's La Suite are also due to Hor Al-Kazmini, Reem Shadid, Judith Greer, Kamal Kassar and Amar Foundation, and Sandra Terjman. The Memory Marathon is supported by the Annenberg Foundation with the generous support of the Memory Circle, Richard and Susan Hayden, and with kind assistance from DLD, the Kensington Hotel, and the Norwegian Embassy. Our partners are The Independent and Another Magazine. Special thanks must go to the Rolex Institute as well as to The Space, who have funded and coordinated our live broadcast. Finally, our advisors for the Memory Marathon are Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron, Eric Hobsbawm, Alice Rawson, Israel Rosenfield, and Tim Bliss. And we thank them all. Thank you very much.
Julia, thank you so very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and fellow travelers, welcome everyone to this year's Memory Marathon. As Julia said, this is very, very connected to the pavilion, and we will have Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron with us here over the next 2 days in many of the conversations. There are conversations, there are presentations, there are performances, there are happenings, there are all kinds of things. It's both a conference, it's a knowledge festival, and it's also a group show of some sort, an exhibition that unfolds in time rather than space. And that's really what the marathon tries to do. And as Julia said, it started all in 2006. Julia came up with the idea of the pavilion already in 2000 and invented this idea of the pavilion with Zaha Hadid. I started with the marathons in 2005, and in 2006 with Rem Koolhaas and Cecile Balmond, we brought this together in the interview marathon. And it was in this interview marathon that all of a sudden we had several protests. It was interesting. It was a portrait of London, and 72 Londoners, spoke about the city. We had Gilbert and George, who made a protest against rucksack, against backpacks. We had Gustav Metzger and a protest against flying. And we had Eric Hobsbawm, who for the first time brought in his protest against forgetting. And this protest against forgetting has accompanied us ever since. We already then thought maybe one day we should do a memory marathon. So it was wonderful when Jacques, Pierre, and Weiwei came up with this idea of the marathon. And as Julia said, sadly, Weiwei cannot be with us, but is here actually digitally present, and he's going to send us all these quotes. But when they came up with the idea of the marathon, it was with the pavilion, it was obviously very clear that that has to be the marathon. It has to be about memory. We went to see Eric Hobsbawm the very first day. This became clear, and Eric was a dear friend and a key protagonist really in the shaping of this year's marathon. We visited him very often and spoke at length about memory, about the instability of witnessing, about what happens to memory in moments of trauma and war. Eric's analysis of the world we live in was as incisive and committed as was the historian himself. Often in our conversations, he would discuss memory in our increasingly accelerating world. And it was also really Eric who suggested that we should make this panel focusing on memory and war, inviting Donald Sassoon and Jay Winter. We're going to have this afternoon, and this will be our homage to Eric. In this very first meeting, he actually wrote a post-it. And I must say that we've got lots of different ways of screening. During the day, you can see all the things on these plasma screens, both in the tent here and also in the lobby of the gallery. In the evening, this will transform into a cinema, and then in the dark space, we will have bigger screenings here. And Eric wrote down on a little post-it sign a motto, really: I belong to a profession whose business it is to protest against forgetting, but which also knows that memory is complex and sometimes dangerous. When we asked him what would be his advice to a young historian, he said, be curious about the world around you. And that's maybe also a nice motto for the next 2 days here. The pavilion is activated throughout these 2 days. So whenever you have time in the breaks, in the coffee breaks, and that's very important, very often in the marathons, what happens between the participants, between all of you, is as important as the speeches. So the idea is that there are going to be lots of walks and possibilities also to spend time in the pavilion and see actually films there. There is going to be the quotes of Ai Weiwei, which you will have permanently present there. And there's also going to be a film, a very special film, of the living memory of Alice Herzog, a pianist teacher and Holocaust survivor who lives in London. She lives in Hampstead and is now 109 years old. And she told us about her 109 years of memory. It was Ron Arad's idea. We went with Ron, who is her neighbor, to see her. And it's really an extraordinary life. Alice was born in 1903. During her childhood, her family was very, very close to Franz Kafka. So she met Franz Kafka and knew him very well. Her husband and son Raphael were then in Theresienstadt concentration camp and returned to Prague in 1945. Alice emigrated to Israel and moved to London in 1986, where she has lived ever since. We'd like to thank here David and Geneviève Sommer from the Raphael Sommer Music Scholarship Trust for permission to screen this interview, and Ron Arad, of course, for the idea. Another participant who exhibits actually all over the 2 days is Gita Bratescu. And you can later, during the day, discover this in the lobby. The lobby is transformed into an exhibition space for the drawings of Gita Bratescu, whom we visited earlier this year in Bucharest. She is an extraordinary pioneer, born in 1926, who studied literature and philology, as well as fine arts in Bucharest. In 1949, Gita was forced to interrupt her studies by the communist regime, and she then finished her art studies in 1971. Between 1963 and 1993, she was part of the editorial team of Secolul 20 magazine, which is really her invention, and that continues now as Secolul 21. once. So at the age of 86 years, she still continues actually to do her own magazine. She has been an inspiration for generations of artists, and throughout these very difficult years has always had a kind of a salon in her studio where many different disciplines met. So it's very, very connected to the marathon. What is fascinating is that Gita made these archaeological drawings. They are kind of drawings of scenes and stratas, labyrinths. They're sort of mappings of the mind and history of the place. And when we saw them for the first time, they looked very, very similar to the drawings of, Weiwei and Herzog de Meuron of the pavilion. So we thought it would be nice to have these drawings, which we're also going to have here on the plasma. In the lobby desk, you can see the originals. Gita also sent us a text. I'm going to read throughout the 2 days fragments from this text. Here is a short fragment from what Gita sent us. Memory, metaphorical flow of existence, blind imprints that rise to the surface and attempt to articulate what is at its source, could never have been articulated, an uninterrupted commentary. And then memory dependent upon a kind of family mythology, when naive literariness engenders images corresponding to a certain ideal about such and such a little family hero. Which came first? Mother's story about it, or my memory of it. The non-existent imaginary white lamb, which went everywhere with me, which I fed from my high chair with a fold-out table, which slept under the bed, and which I wept for, sobbing uncontrollably when I saw its flayed head floating in the soup tureen. Similarly, I shall never know how much I owe memory for the so vivid image of grandfather catching a pigeon, wrapping it in a white napkin and holding it in front of me, all nicely wrapped up, just long enough for me to be able to stroke the top of its head. I'm doubtful about the authenticity of this image as pure memory, for it brings together an entire inventory of objects and impressions seeded over the course of many years. The photographic portrait of grandfather, a very gentle face with a white goatee, the large heavy damask napkins grandmother left us, and which we still use to this day, and the voracious pigeons of tourist towns. Nevertheless, this hoax, memory, is needful to me. It is my performance about myself. It nourishes the substance of my being, lends it depth. Without it, I would be condemned to mere nowness, to the condition of a playbill.